You want the kids in school, which I know they do. Why wouldn't you want them to be able to wear masks? Because that makes it more likely they'd be in school. Welcome back, listeners, to Bourbon in the Back Room. This is our 26th episode, Joel. 26, man. That is hard to believe. We started last January, or this January, I suppose. Seems like a long time ago. Bringing knowledge about South Carolina government and politics to the listeners of South Carolina. Dear listeners, friends, thanks for all the support. Remember to share this episode and the link to all your family and friends, because we got to get those numbers even higher. It's amazing, Joel, how many people are listening to the show right now. To learn more about South Carolina government and politics, listeners, send us your thoughts and comments at BITBR on Facebook or Twitter, or send us an email, bourboninthebackroom@gmail.com. We've got a very interesting guest that Joel will introduce in a little while. A little bit of a different take for the show than we normally do. We're going to focus about government and politics in South Carolina in the past, in a specific episode that really helped spur the civil rights movement in South Carolina and across the nation. But before we do that, we're going to catch up on what's happening in South Carolina government and politics, brought to you by Joel Lurie. Joel, tell our listeners what's happening in South Carolina government and politics.
Vincent, great to be back. It's our 26th episode.
Amazing.
And for this episode, you remember we told the story of Uncle Nearest.
Yes.
We're drinking some of the Uncle Nearest 1884 small batch whiskey given to us by our friend Hamilton Grant. Let's take a quick sip.
Cheers to Hamilton.
Cheers to our 26th episode.
And just as a reminder to all of the whiskey or bourbon lovers out there, if you want us to promote your favorite bourbon or whiskey, just
give us a bottle
by Lurie Life and Health.
Absolutely.
Health insurance rates go up.
There you go. So couple things going on. First of all, Vincent, I need to ask you, we had some friends over Saturday night, and we were watching the South Carolina football game, but did Clemson play this last weekend?
Actually, they didn't play.
They didn't play. Is it true? Is it true?
I mean, again, who did you? I pulled for USC, but were they playing Memphis State?
All right, look.
Coppin State?
So let me. Clemson does not need to talk to us about our schedule, okay? But if I remember correctly, have y'all not lost 2 games in a row?
Oh, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Think about that.
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to be in the football elite when every time you play the football elite, you lose. No, you lost to Ohio State.
That's right.
Remember that was last year when Dabo said that Ohio State doesn't belong in the Final Four, and then they got their ass kicked.
As a Clemson fan, it's hard to lose because we're just not used to it.
Yeah, well, you're not used to playing good teams. All right, let's go on and talk a little bit about what's happening in South Carolina politics. So, interesting story on Fitz News. Our old buddy Will Folks wrote a story that Senator Katrina Shealy, Vincent, is considering a Republican primary run against Henry McMaster. Tell us what that's all about.
Well, we had Senator Shealy, our friend Katrina, on the show, about 6 months ago? I think she did.
Oh, boy, this is strong, by the way. Try it. Yeah, it's very strong.
She did not hide the fact she was unhappy with Governor McMaster, not so much for his politics or legislation, but she's not felt like his agency have performed like they should. I think she talked about the Department of Social Services debacle that existed for so long. It's gotten better, and particularly about the Department of Juvenile Justice. Knowing Katrina, and you know her well as I do, if not better, it really gets in her crawl when she sees kids or vulnerable people suffering. Look, her running for governor is not in the normal wheelhouse of Katrina Shealy. She doesn't seek the limelight. I really don't think she likes the limelight. Actually caught me by surprise. I'm interested to hear what you think. It would be a heavy lift for her. It would be a difficult campaign. I'd say ultimately she probably doesn't do it, but she's sending a message loud and clear about her unhappiness with Governor McMaster. What are your thoughts?
I think you're right. I think she has, and in particular, Katrina, God bless her, has been so involved in issues relating to children. We talked about that when she was on our show. She's very much involved in working. Even when I was in the Senate on the DSS issue, she is absolutely disgusted by the way what's happening at DJJ, and she can't understand why the governor continues to keep the director. At the end of the day, I think this is just a shot across the bow, Vincent. Do I think she'll run? Gosh, if she runs, if you and I could help her, we would. It would probably hurt her, but no, I don't think so. The sad thing though, Vincent, and we discovered this in your last race in 2014. Outside of the political bubble, people should care about issues like DSS and DJJ, but they just don't connect with the public.
Yeah. The public does not care about how, unfortunately, it used to be, when your dad was in politics, my uncle, our family, the goings on of state government were plastered across every page. I can remember my dad was the chairman of CHS, Commission on Higher Education. Reporters used to cover their meetings. I mean, there would be TV cameras there. People, for whatever reason, just aren't tuned into South Carolina government and politics. Part of why we have this show, and they certainly don't vote based on the performance of state government.
There's no question about that. Moving right along, interesting article in the state newspaper this week. We've talked a lot about reapportionment on our podcast, Vincent. And as you know, the House and the Senate have their reapportionment subcommittees meeting right now. They're having public hearings. We talked in great length on our last episode about some of the challenges that the rural communities will face, even in the Senate, on being able to keep a resident senator, or how many counties will be in one Senate district. Yesterday, Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter and Senator Mike Fanning.
So from Orangeburg and Fairfield, two rural counties.
Both rural legislators who, by the way, whose districts are way under where they need to be, announced the introduction of legislation that would require a legislative process to do reapportionment. Apparently, we're the only state in the country that doesn't define that process by statute.
Interesting.
As you remember, the committees come together and they set their own policies. And does that have any chance in passing, Vincent?
No, it does not, because
well, that was a lot of thought there.
The number one rule of reapportionment, with rare exceptions, and those exceptions, for whatever reason, have been democratically controlled states. But with rare exception, the number one rule is the party in power will never give up any control over the ability to reapportion as they see fit. And if you pass a law that you have to follow, that means you're giving up a little bit of control. So I would have guessed that we'll see things as usual. And, in the last reapportionment in 2010, I suppose, the Republican Party made sure they stayed entrenched and made sure that the direction of electoral politics trended Republican as far as how the lines were drawn. But I won't say that they were overly aggressive compared to what we'd seen before that. So hopefully it'll again be I'd love to see a neutral process where truly, South Carolina had what it always votes, which is about 45% Democratic and 55% Republican, reflected in the bodies. I'd love to see
never
that.
happen.
That's not going to happen.
I mean, if you think about that, let's look at that number again. We have 7 congressional districts, right?
Yeah.
We have 1 Democratic district.
It's crazy.
Yeah, by that math, we should have 3, right?
We should. It should be, if you drew fair districts in the state, you'd have 4 neutral districts in the state. You'd have 4 Republican Congress members, and you'd have 3 Democratic Congress members.
Yeah.
That's what really should happen.
I was talking to one of the state senators involved on the Senate side of this, and as I mentioned last time, he's very concerned. He's a Democrat. We have 16 seats in the Senate just because of the sheer loss in numbers in the rural communities, and what that could mean. Some senators could get drawn out of their districts. We could be lucky to come back with 14.
Yeah.
It's pretty scary.
Gerrymandering has a long history, as we know, from Elbridge Gerry, who was a
lieutenant governor. No, the governor of Massachusetts.
Yes, and the namesake of gerrymandering. It's gone on a long time, but with the scientific computerization of data, it's just reached a pretty much ridiculous extreme.
I think I forgot what year it was, but there was a picture of a salamander in the Boston Gazette, and that's where the term gerrymandering came from. Vincent, by the time this podcast will air, we will have recognized the 20th anniversary of September 11th, an event that changed life for all Americans and really changed sort of the way we view things all around the world. And it certainly had a profound impact on me and you and all of South Carolina. Do you remember where you were on September the 11th, 2001?
Yeah, I was a fairly newly elected House member at the time. And Amy and I had just had Anthony, that year, not even a full year before, I don't believe. And I was teaching at the law school at that time. And I left the law school, and somebody had mentioned that a plane had hit one of the towers. And you'll remember, everybody didn't really know what was happening, and I didn't. And I drove to Lugoff, which is in my district, to an elementary school to read to the kids. I think it was Dr. Seuss Day. It was like reading day.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You know,
And
given what President Bush was doing at the time.
Which is probably why he was doing it.
Yeah.
And I remember putting on the Dr. Seuss hat and reading to the kids. And then when I was walking out, my cousin, I believe, or one of the other teachers who worked at the school told me what was going on. And on the way there, I had been listening to the radio, and it just, the urgency and the fear. It was a day. It's like the shuttle exploding in my life.
Yeah.
I'll never forget where I was that day. I'll never forget this. I'm sure you're the same. And just to remark on the fact how it's affected us all. Certainly we're seeing that in Afghanistan right now. And our friend James Smith, I can't help but think about, who went re-enrolled in the military in the infantry when he was a lawyer in the military in the Guard, and was deployed to Afghanistan. And I remember him calling us from the satellite phone on the top of some mountain in the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan. It's had a profound effect on all our lives, I think. So
interesting you mentioned James. I'll tell you an interesting story. So I was working in our family business, Lurie's department store. I think that suit you have on today is still from Lurie's, even though we closed 12 years ago.
They're good suits.
Yeah, they're great suits. But I was working at Lurie's, and I remember the first plane hitting, and then, a lot of people thought that was an accident. The second plane hitting. But let me tell you an interesting story. James called me because his law firm was right down the street. Yeah. And he said, let's go in, check in at the governor's office, see kind of how the state is responding.
Jim Hodges was governor.
Jim Hodges was governor, right, 2001. So he picks me up, and we go over there. And you remember my dear high school friend who was very close to your family, Steve Bates. Yeah. Steve Bates was that time chief legal counsel for Governor Hodges. Steve sadly passed away Thanksgiving, I think 2006, 2005. Great guy. I've known him since elementary school, actually. Forest Lake Elementary all the way up. So Steve, we check in with Steve, and we kind of, he talks to us a little bit about the state response. But Steve says, Joel, another high school friend of ours, Rob Lenore, used to work in the second tower, but I think he's moved out. That night, Steve calls me and says, I got terrible news. He said, I was wrong. Rob had not moved out of the building. The last time his family heard from him, he was evacuating, and they never heard from him again. And, it was just terrible. And when I went to the 9/11 memorial, a couple of years ago, I found where, Rob's name was on one of the plaques. But what a terrible tragedy.
Yeah, and what a change in the way the nation, really acted for 20 years, regardless of how anybody feels about the things we did or didn't do. Change was coming because of that act.
You mentioned reading to a classroom. I saw one of the news channels is going to have a special with some of the kids that were in the classroom 20 years ago.
With George Bush.
Yeah, I still remember that like it was yesterday. Okay, Vincent, I want to move on to one or two more current events. In our last episode, we talked about the Supreme Court ruling, and we had a BITBRP, a bourbon in the backroom prediction, and you predicted that the City of Columbia case would not succeed.
Yes.
But you also felt like that the District 2 case had a chance.
Well, Joel, it's right to be right even when you don't want to be right.
Well, we'll see what happens this next time.
And I don't know that I'll be right in the next time based on how this case was worded. But here's where we're at, just to remind everybody. We had really two cases that were about whether or not masks could be required in schools. One was filed against the City of Columbia because the City of Columbia enacted a mask mandate for the schools in the City of Columbia. And when you asked me about that, I told you I didn't think it would be likely to succeed, and this is why. The cities have very limited powers in South Carolina. They aren't like the state, and they're not even like school districts, which have pretty wide power in the school arena. Cities have really defined powers, and so that was a strike against them going into this. And the Supreme Court indeed said, and if you read the opinion, this might be helpful for the school districts, they said that to comply with the city's requirement would surely involve the expenditure of state money. And if you recall, the ban on mask mandates was contained in the state budget and related to the expenditure of state money. So if the school districts are smart and they want to be successful, they're going to have to show the Supreme Court how they can use non-state money to enforce the mask mandate.
And did they do that in their case? Did you watch the hearing?
I did not watch the hearing, and I don't know whether or not they have we won't know if they successfully done that until we hear from the court. But I will say the simple fact that the court's still looking at it, whereas they pretty quickly kicked the Columbia case, tells you that there's a really good debate going on. There's also we haven't talked about this, but the ACLU brought suit in federal court challenging the same proviso that the General Assembly passed, stating that it discriminated against children with handicaps and special needs. I don't know a lot about that area of law. That seems like it's a tough claim to make. But we'll see. There's another front where it's being followed.
All right, let me ask you this question. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a business guy, as you know. So I tend to try to simplify things that lawyers sometimes confuse. Okay, but why couldn't you just say, look, the school resource officers, which are the county deputies, will enforce the mask provision?
Yeah, well, because I think that's naive, because that teachers are going to have to be involved as well, and that's why the court rejected the argument by the city.
But I thought they rejected the argument by the city because they basically said the city can't set school policy.
That's part of it, but at the end of the day, remember the bill itself says that the expenditure of state money can't be used to enforce it. And if Columbia has the mandate, then really the teachers should be abiding by the mandate, and the teachers are paid in part by state dollars. And so I think the road to success on this case for the people who want mask mandates to be legal is going to have to focus on the money and where the money to enforce it comes from. I will say, though, Joel, clearly the school districts and I would say parents want it, because if school districts enact it, they're hearing from parents. Since the original mask mandate of Richland 2, Charleston, I believe, has enforced one or has enacted one. York has, and Chester County has.
All right, last thing, Vincent, before we talk about COVID, the issue that pretty much dominates the headlines. We have gotten a lot of questions and comments from people about the Murdaugh case in Hampton County. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand, you can't be in South Carolina politics and not know the Murdaughs and know of their involvement in the sort of the legal system and in politics. And what happened there was a horrific tragedy, Vincent. But you and I talk politics. We speculate about things. This is a criminal case going on, and I just don't think it's our role to really take it a whole lot further than just talk about how horrible it is and watch it unfold like everybody else.
Yeah, well, you and I don't really know anything about what's going on there to comment about either, except to say that it looks like a tragedy, a tragic situation, and I believe there are criminal podcasts that are out there for our people that want to listen more about that kind of thing. On
to COVID, Vincent. I got a couple of things here we need to talk about because it continues to dominate the headlines. The state newspaper editorial board just ran an editorial this week, and I just want to read a couple of lines from it because I think it sets the stage. The frustration and desperation in school board member Patricia Reinhardt's Jackson voice was palpable even on Line Street. Quote, "I don't want to lose another life within the district," she said, as the Aiken County Board of Education considered what it could do to combat the spread of COVID-19 amongst the district's 23,000 students and 3,000 employees. As of Tuesday night, more than 4,000 of the district students were in quarantine. 5 members of the school district family, 2 students ages 9 and 15, 3 staff members have died from COVID-19. And it just goes on to talk about the board chairman, Dr. John Bradley, says the legislature seems to want to be on the school board. They're politicizing the education of our children. Every member of the state legislature should be forced to watch these board meetings and see what their careless decisions have caused. And now this is the editorial board. How could any member of the legislature watch the events in Aiken County or anywhere else in our state and not understand that the ripple effects of tying school districts' hands with the ban on mask mandates are hurting our children and our community? Repeal the proviso and return control to South Carolina schools. Vincent.
Well, in fact, the state is ultimately responsible for education in South Carolina under our state constitution. So the responsibility either way rests squarely with the state. And you and I both are a little puzzled. I mean, a lot puzzled as to why they would want to take this on the General Assembly as they have. I'll say this to our listeners especially, but to you as well. We're dealing with children who cannot be vaccinated. So it's not like you and I walking in a grocery store without a mask on who have been vaccinated and are staying 20 feet away from anybody. These are kids who have not been vaccinated who are going to be sitting right next to each other in a classroom or cafeteria. And what really puzzles me is there was no stronger proponent for opening the schools than Vincent was when I was a state senator and the coronavirus was hitting. I mean, and I was against what many of my Democratic friends were saying, but the kids needed to be in school. Well, to my Republican colleagues, I'm saying now, if you want the kids in school, which I know they do, why wouldn't you want them to be able to wear masks? Because that makes it more likely they'd be in school. I really don't understand it. I'm still puzzled.
It's counterproductive, counterintuitive to what they were trying to do.
Yeah, it's just crazy and it's unfortunate. But I don't think there's the will to revisit it this year. You know, come January, if it still matters, I bet this proviso's not in the budget again.
Yeah, I sure shit hope not. But it'll be interesting. I think a lot of this will depend on what happens with the Supreme Court case in Richland District 2.
Yeah,
and we talked about that. And, you know, the connection between their actions and the loss of life, or in this case now their inaction, I'm not sure if the Supreme Court does not rule in a favorable way to District 2 and the numbers are continuing to peak, which is what they are right now, it wouldn't surprise me if enough pressure comes out for them to have to come back in, but we'll see.
Well, I hope that the court will rule quickly because that decision needs to be made now one way or the other.
All right. Speaking of local governments, we've had remarkable development here in the Midlands, Vincent. Just this week, the city of Casey, the city of West Columbia, and the city of Columbia have now imposed mask mandates for anyone going inside, for anyone going in buildings. I want to play a quick clip from an interview from Steve Benjamin on WLTX.
We've gotten consistent and regular communication from both Prisma and Lexington Medical. Lexington Medical CEO Todd Augsburger sent us the very same letter he sent to those governing bodies, and I shared it with our council. We get daily updates from Prisma that show today record high numbers of folks with in the ICU, with over 90% of them being unvaccinated citizens of the Midlands. So we've got to do our fair share to make sure that we're putting policies in place that keep people healthy and safe and saves lives.
Vincent, that is our friend and former guest, Mayor Steve Benjamin, who, as you know, unsuccessfully tried to impose his own mask mandate in the schools, and we talked about the Supreme Court. But gosh, as you know, he's got the heart of a lion because he really cares about children. And so now he has led the fight. And I'm really proud of 2 municipalities in Lexington County have done the same thing.
Well, Joel, before we leave that topic on a maybe not quite a serious note, but also a serious note, I saw where the mayor endorsed a candidate to be his successor. That
is true. The mayor has just endorsed his protege for many years, Sam Johnson. I love Sam.
Sam's a great guy.
Yep. And if the calendar permits, I'd like to have a little mayor's forum on Bourbon in the Back Room.
Great idea. Our friend Tamika is also running.
Daniel Rickman.
Yes.
But he has. But speaking of the city of Columbia, and do you see more local municipalities taking it upon themselves now?
I think you may say it in some of the bigger ones where there are more concentrations of people. I don't think out in the rural areas you're going to see a lot of that. And I especially think people who are vaccinated, you know, they want to have some flexibility. You know, I wear it. I try to wear it when I'm in concentrated areas. But frankly, if I'm, 10 or 15 feet away from people, I'm vaccinated. I don't wear one.
Yeah, I'll tell you who I feel really bad for are the people that work like in our grocery stores. I was in, and I'm hoping the municipality I shop in, Forest Acres, will impose the same thing. I was in the Publix this weekend and just see about half the crowd in there walking around without a mask. And I was talking to the cashiers. They're doing their job. Yet they're basically being exposed to danger every time somebody gets in their face. And they got those little plastic shields, but those only go so far. And it just really pisses me off, to be honest with you.
I think if you follow your grandmother's rule, you can't go wrong. And that is to treat other people respectfully. When I walk in a store, if there's a sign that just says, please wear a mask, why wouldn't you do it? If that's what your host wants you to do, why wouldn't you do it?
All right. Last point on COVID is the way it affects children. Our friend Jason Raven with WSPA just did a story this weekend. I want to play a few clips from it, and then we'll sort it out and introduce our guest.
Great. Can't wait to get to
According to the South Carolina Children's Hospital Collaborative, all children hospitalized in their member hospitals for COVID-19 in the state are unvaccinated. Now, the majority of those children are under the age of 12 and can't get the vaccine. Now, Executive Director Maggie Cash says what they're seeing right now is very different from what they saw last year. Currently, 9 children are on a ventilator in their member hospitals. Now, Cash says that number is higher than the number of children they had on a ventilator last year. Now, she added they're recommending masks in schools and for children 12 and older to get vaccinated.
I'm hopeful that people will rise to the occasion and take this virus very seriously, because it's not the flu. It's not a cold. It is a very serious virus. And you can't bank on the fact that your child is young and healthy.
Cash says 85 to 95% of the staff beds at their member hospitals are full right now. Now, their hospitals have surge plans in place if things get worse. And according to DHEC, there are now 5,865 COVID-19 cases associated with South Carolina public and private schools.
Vincent, so the bottom line is this, and a friend of mine heard a person from DHEC speak this week. This strain of COVID is much more dangerous to children.
Right.
And as you stated earlier, children under the age of 12 cannot get the vaccine, and the children's hospitals are at capacity right now. We can only hope and pray that this virus has peaked and the numbers will start coming down. And I say that on a day today, today, September 9th, where the state just passes 11,000 deaths due to COVID.
And surprise, surprise, South Carolina has the highest ratio of people infected by the coronavirus of any state in America.
And that's disgraceful.
Yeah, but not surprising.
But that is absolutely disgraceful. And Vincent, because you stay much more in touch with the news than I do, and what has Governor McMaster's response been the last few weeks?
I hadn't heard from him.
Okay, we will be right back. Let's hear from our sponsor and introduce our guest.
Joel, tell us about Lexington Medical Center.
Vincent, they make it very easy to get an appointment. You can go to their portal, do all of this online. You'll find that when you have an appointment, everything runs on time. And for people that are busy, that's very important. Nobody wants to sit in a doctor's office all day. They answer all your questions. They follow up with whenever necessary. And to be honest with you, they make each patient feel like they're the most important person in the world. And that's why, Vincent, they have been voted for many consecutive years the best hospital in the Midlands.
And that's why, Joel, they're our sponsor.
Thank you, Lexington Medical Center. Vincent, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Patricia Sullivan. She is a professor of history in the College of Arts and Sciences, and she is working today from her home in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Pat Sullivan specializes in modern U.S. history with an emphasis on African-American history, race relations, and the history of the civil rights movement. She has written many books, including her recent book, Justice Rising, which has gotten great reviews, a story of Bobby Kennedy. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. But Pat Sullivan, welcome to the podcast, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to tell a story about something that happened in South Carolina some time ago that really shaped a lot of the debate and the civil rights movement. Welcome to the show, Pat.
Thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you, and I hope to see you soon in person and have a little drink of bourbon. My work has been, as you said, Joel, on sort of the history of the South, the African-American experience, civil rights struggles. And South Carolina, in the course of my work, my first book and my second book, was a major focus because it really was a crossroads in the civil rights struggle, particularly in the period we'll be talking about today. World War II. But I met that wonderful generation when I was a graduate student many years ago of John McCrae and Majestica Simpkins. And South Carolina has taught me a lot as someone from the North about just the dynamic struggle around race and civil rights and the remarkable cast of people who have been involved in all kinds of ways.
Professor, it's funny you say that because on the show we talk about often, for good or for ill, South Carolina, pretty small state, seems to play a major, major role from things that happen in our politics, our government, and our culture in this country, starting from the colonial era all the way down to Jim Clyburn and Lindsey Graham right now. And of course, the Charleston massacre that we went through here, that Joel and I were both involved in the aftermath of. For some reason, this little old state just plays a larger role than you would think. And part of that is why we wanted you on the show today to talk about one of those instances in history. And I'll let Joel begin to talk about that and a few other things.
Yeah, Pat, so we're going to, because the subject of the day is the story of Isaac Woodard. So tell our listeners, who was Isaac Woodard?
Isaac Woodard was and the reason we're talking about him, he was a young man from South Carolina who fought in World War II, distinguished himself, fought in the Pacific, distinguished himself in battle. He emerged as a leader of his segregated unit, was awarded a medal and was promoted as far as sergeant. So he's really went to war as a young man and distinguished himself in service, serving in a segregated army. And like many of his generation, I think 900,000 African Americans served in the war. They came back expecting something different. And of course, what happened to him, I guess we will be talking about that, really brought him to the center of national attention. And he became sort of a pivotal figure in pulling together these different elements in South Carolina and nationally at this critical moment in the struggle for civil rights.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't he from right up the road in Fairfield County?
So more of a rural part
Yeah,
of the
grew up
state.
in rural South Carolina, I believe, right?
Right. And so, yeah, as we know, he's growing up at a time when segregation is entrenched. I mean, it's deeply entrenched. He would be someone who grew up during the Depression years. And so he would be someone who didn't have the benefit of equal education. And I think when you think of young men like Isaac Woodard, who ended up going to fight in World War II, there was a sense that nothing would change. Now, of course, he's part of a community and a family. And when people think about the endurance of African Americans and what happens when the opportunities present themselves, that people really seize efforts to secure their rights and their citizenship. So he surely had something in his background that prepared him to distinguish himself in World War II in the Pacific, and then when he came home to really stand up, and it would seem like a minor encounter that became a major.
We know that especially in the rural South for whites and blacks, but especially so for blacks, entering the military was a way to lift up their future lives, whether it was getting off of the sharecropping farm or leaving the poor town. And that would have been especially so for someone like Isaac Woodard, who came from a rural area and was African American. Is that right?
Oh, totally. I mean, it's transformative. And you think of some of the names we do know of people who came back, African-American soldiers like Medgar Evers and Charles Evers. And, the war really is a way out, and experience that is transformative for them.
All right. So, Pat, he is discharged on February 12th, 1946. He is traveling home from Georgia to South Carolina. Tell us what happens.
He's released to Camp Gordon and boards a bus in Augusta, Georgia, heading home. And along the way, I mean, he is with other soldiers, and he needs to relieve himself. And there were no restrooms on buses back then. So the policy was if a passenger needed to do that, the bus driver let the person off and they took care of it. And so he went to the driver and asked him to stop. And the driver just swore at him and said, well, I'm not stopping. We're running late. Just go back in your seat. Be still. And was really offensive. And, there's a great statement that Richard Gergel quotes in his book. But I am, I'm a man just like you. Talk to me like a man. And of course, that was considered pretty aggressive. So when the bus got to Batesburg, the bus driver got off and looked for a police officer, found a police chief, Leonard Shaw, and brought him to the bus. And he said he had a couple of soldiers on board who were drunk and disorderly and wanted them removed from the bus. So the police chief goes on, and Woodard is the one who's pointed out. And he's, I guess the bus driver told him to come off the bus. That's right. The police chief didn't go. Bus driver said he needed to come off the bus. So he came off the bus, and the police chief was waiting. And Isaac Woodard tried to explain what happened on the bus. And Shaw told him to shut up and hit him with his club. And, Richard Gergel goes into great detail about these clubs, how with a metal tip and very powerful. And so Isaac Woodard stops talking, and they're going to arrest him for disorderly conduct. So as they're walking towards the jail, again, this is recounted from all the various documents that Richard found. Shaw asks him if he's coming back from the war. And when he says yes, the police chief says, "Yes, sir." This was an insult to him that he didn't say sir. And he started to beat him again with this club. And at that point, Woodard grabs the club from Shaw, right? And the accompanying police officer pulls a gun and says, "Drop it or I'll drop you." And so he drops the club. Shaw picks it up and beats him fiercely.
Pokes him in the eyes, doesn't he? Doesn't he pretty much poke him in both of the eyes?
Well, that's when that happens. And he's beating him on the head and neck, and then takes the club and basically thrusts it into each of his eyes.
Pat, let me stop you real quick for 1 second, because you keep mentioning Richard Gergel, so this is a great time for our audience. She is referring to federal judge Richard Gergel, who recently published a book a year or so ago called Unexampled Courage. And he tells the story of Isaac Woodard. He tells the story of Judge Waits Waring that we're going to talk about. And he incorporates that with Harry Truman. It's an incredible book. And, Richard being a federal judge, obviously can't come on a political podcast, but I read the book, as so many other South Carolinians, as so many around the country have read it. Richard's spoken at the Truman Library before. But I just wanted to, because you've mentioned Richard a couple of times, I wanted just to remind our audience who he is. And I believe, Vincent, Richard was actually the federal judge that oversaw the Dylann Roof case too, right? He
did. And of course, Richard practiced law here in Columbia, for those of our listeners in Columbia, for many years, and is now, as a federal district judge, living and presiding over court down in Charleston, where Judge Waring also presided over court back in the early part of last century. So getting back to the story, Joel.
Yeah, Pat. So all right. So Woodard is poked in the eyes. All right. What happens next? I guess he goes for trial for disorderly conduct, and just kind of briefly walk us through the sequence of events that ultimately leads us to a guy named Waits Waring.
We'll sort of move forward pretty quickly, because it goes from being something that happens in this small town to a national event. And again, which I just mentioning Richard's book, what we talked about earlier, this story really pulls together so much of this history. And so he's taken to prison, and he's overnight, sleeps, falls asleep, and the sheriff comes in the morning, the police chief, and realizes he wakes up, he can't see. And so they transfer him to the Veterans Hospital in Columbia. And he really has nowhere to go. I mean, his wife, who was waiting for him, is not interested in taking care of a blinded husband. And so he is going to make his way to New York. But I think a major thing that's brought out in the book, and which is really important to understanding this history, is the role of the Black press. And of course, John McCrae investigates this. He runs he's the editor of the Lighthouse and Informer, based out of Columbia, and gets word to the NAACP in New York, and he's involved with the NAACP. And in the meantime, Isaac Woodard makes his way to New York, where his family is, to be with them in the Bronx. And the NAACP, Walter White, contacts him, and he ends up coming into their office, and things develop from there around this case.
Okay, so Pat, can you hear me okay?
No.
Okay, all right. So he makes his way to New York. The NAACP office in New York becomes very interested in, you mentioned the name Walter White. Ultimately, how does this get back to a federal court in South Carolina?
Right. Well, it's a number of hard work and coincidences. It's remarkable, right? So it's in the NAACP. It starts to make its way into the news, but they don't have the full story. The correct town is not identified. They say Aiken instead of Batesburg, and they don't know the name of who did this to Isaac Woodard. But so the NAACP is connected with the great Orson Welles, who has a very popular radio show, and we're
talking about Orson Welles, who was all over the nation on the radio at the time, right?
Major, figure, young, but just he's really coming into his peak, and this very popular radio show. And of course, back then, radio was our social media. That's how we connected up and got news across state boundaries and all the rest. And so he gets in on it. And finally, with all of this searching around and news, they discover it's Batesburg, not Aiken. And they discover the name of
Chief Scholl, Linwood Scholl.
Linwood Scholl. And by this time, it's summer of 1946. Isaac Woodard had this encounter in February. And Black veterans across the South are facing all kinds of violence. And some of it gets pretty widely publicized. And again, the NAACP is very involved in trying to bring this to the attention of the nation and to President Truman. And so by the end of the summer, Truman's paying attention. Walter White has a meeting with other civil rights leaders with Truman, and they bring this case to his attention of Isaac Woodard.
All right, let me pause you right there. Let's just talk about that for a second. So Harry Truman, who, by the way, was president because Franklin Roosevelt dies, a couple of months into his, I guess, third term. Is that right?
Fourth term.
Okay. So Truman is president. And I became very interested in Truman by reading this book. Just read another book, interestingly enough, written by Chris Wallace about the dilemmas Truman faced when he was trying to decide what to do about the atom bomb. Okay. So Truman grew up in Missouri on a farm, not necessarily a staunch advocate for civil rights, but isn't it true, Pat, that he just becomes outraged that Black veterans, Black soldiers are returning home and being treated very poorly, right? Yes.
He's shocked, to see this. And as we said, it's getting a lot of publicity. No, he reacts viscerally to this, as is described in the book, and feels like something has to be done. And of course, civil rights leaders are looking to the president to do something. And what he can do is get his Justice Department in gear to investigate these various cases and, where possible, to bring court action. And that's what happens in the case of Isaac Woodard.
Okay, so they bring, here's an interesting name for you, Vincent, Claude Sapp. So they bring charges in South Carolina. The U.S. attorney at the time was a guy by the name of Claude Sapp. Now, interestingly enough, when I read that name, I went and started Googling around. Claude Sapp was the father of a guy by the name of Joe Sapp, who was like Mr. Democrat.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Remember Joe Sapp in the 70s and 80s?
Wow.
And really good friend of my dad's. Joe and Helen Sapp used to come to our house. So his dad, and I'm going to say, was a very reluctant U.S. attorney. So they bring charges here, and just jumping ahead in the interest of time, Pat, tell us about Judge Waite Waring.
Well, he's key to so much of the story. And your point about attorney Claude Sapp, what you see is that these people are functioning in this environment, that civil rights cases are not things you pursue. I mean, there's a local pressure, there's a culture, there's this just the normalcy of segregation and of these abuses that happen. But Judge Wady Swearing is sort of the game changer here in the South. Born and raised in Charleston, well established politically, and he's an attorney. He early on gets connected up with Burnett Maybank and the famous Senator Cotton Ed Smith. In fact,
these are all old South Carolina names. Yeah. Vincent's nodding his head.
They're all still around.
Yeah, Bernie Maybank, right? Yeah, right. It's his grandson, I guess.
Yeah, they're all still around. All right, different generations.
All right, so he gets connected with them, but for the sake of our audience here, for all practical purposes, Judge Waring is part of Old Charleston. He's very well respected, but he presides over this case. And tell us about what happens in the case and how that changes his life forever.
Well, okay, so he goes on the federal bench because of these two senators who he was very close to politically. So he's well established politically. I mean, and it's and in society and all the rest. But the Isaac Woodard case comes into his court, and that is a eye-opening experience for him. Prior to that, though, he had ruled. There's something about Judge Waring that's really interesting in terms of when he's confronted with racial injustice as a judge, he reacts in a way that was surprising to someone like Thurgood Marshall. There were teacher salary equalization cases in 1944, and he rules in favor of the NAACP case that Black teachers should have equal salaries. So he's sort of moving in a way that's interesting. But it's not, and he's a moderate, gradualism. He doesn't want federal intervention. Then he has to preside over the case of Isaac Woodard. And when he sees Isaac Woodard, sees him, this blinded man, veteran, and realizes when he sees the case made by the Justice Department attorney, which is not very well prepared, and of course by the defense of Linwood Shaw, the whole process is transforming. Because even before the jury goes out, he knows how this is going to end up. So the jury comes back, and quickly, he leaves the courtroom for about 20 minutes, so they can't come back right away. And not guilty is what they rule in terms of Linwood Shaw. And for Wady Swearing and his wife Elizabeth, who was in the courtroom, this was really traumatic. To see this clear case of this young soldier being blinded, brutalized by this police chief, and no justice in the courtroom in this jury trial. And, it's the beginning. I mean, there's our friend Richard Burgle writes in his book, The World of Jim Crow suddenly came into focus for Judge Waring. And I think really it's important to realize that he's rare, but he's in a position to do something about it. So the Woodard case is a turning point for him. He and his wife began reading about Southern history. I mean, just trying to understand this world. And we can move on from there, but it really changes him. It's transformative.
And so, Professor, just to get ahead in the judge's life, I mean, ultimately, he between the reaction of the public in Charleston and his friends or former friends and his own reaction to what's happening, it really changes his life and his future. Tell us what happens to the judge ultimately.
Well, I mean, now that he's kind of prepared to face these cases in his court and rule in favor of equal justice and fairness, he becomes a target of attacks. I mean, socially they're sort of isolated, and cross burned in his yard. I mean, a case that follows this is the enforcement of the white primary ruling, which was in 1944. South Carolina refuses to really abide by that ruling. And
let me interrupt you real quick, Pat. So, Vincent, this is interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, but we are like the last state in the country, surprise, surprise, to integrate the Democratic primary. Correct? Right. And
well, the purpose of the Democratic primary and primaries as a whole was to have an election before the election so they could be all white.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Pat, I remember something in the book where he gets wind that there's going to try to be people to obstruct the rights of African Americans to vote in the primary. And there's some case or some hearing, and he basically says, look, I got an option to either fine you or stick you in prison, and I'm not inclined to fine you. But he pretty much lays the law down to open the door for African Americans to vote, correct?
Clearly. I mean, there are two back-to-back cases, the Elmore case and the Baskin case. And in the second case, he rules at one point that they have to open the primary. They find a way around that. So another case comes forward that the NAACP brings, and that's what it's, brilliant. He said, I can either, fine you or your jail term. There will be no fine. And that did it. I mean, that was in the summer of 1948, July of 1948, in advance of the presidential election, the primary that summer, And there are images of African Americans lined up in Columbia and throughout the state to vote in the primary.
Professor, at this time, there's a lot going on in South Carolina. There's a lot going on in South Carolina's civil rights activity, including the Briggs versus Elliott case, which is coming, right? Which really is Brown versus Board of Education, but here in South Carolina.
Yeah, connect those dots for us, Pat. So Briggs versus Elliott, because when we think about Waits Waring and the impact he had on so many things, you just mentioned the Democratic primary. We talked about Isaac Woodard. But tell us how ultimately this translates into Briggs versus Elliott and then becomes Brown versus Board.
Very important. And each builds on the next, I mean, with his experiences and his going further out on the limb. And I wanted to say, after the 48 rulings in the primary, they were the targets of attacks and threats and all the rest. And the next year, the Briggs case is coming up. And the NAACP is, and Judge Waring is following this, and he wants to rule on a case that will really take on segregation. And by this time, he and Thurgood Marshall have been in court together and developed a professional relationship. Marshall understands that Waring's an extraordinary Southern jurist. And so the Briggs case comes up, and by this time, they're suing for equalization, to make separate but equal work. The NAACP has all intentions of attacking Plessy directly, but they're building precedents. They're trying to, keep up with the community and not push too fast, which will have repercussions for people in their communities. And as this equalization case is coming before Waits Waring, he meets with Marshall and he says, I want a case that will challenge segregation head on. And Marshall said, well, I don't think it's time. They go back and forth. Judge Waring persuades Marshall, now is the time. And that's what Waring says. And so Marshall has a new pleading where they will challenge segregation directly. But in the interim, and this is important for think about Marshall's thinking, they go to the community of Clarendon County to make sure that the plaintiffs on that brief are ready to go all the way, and they were.
And one can only imagine the intimidation, the physical attacks that the plaintiffs had to endure. There's some great stories about how the community, the African-American community in Clarendon County really protected one another because so many people had to leave, Vincent.
Ultimately, they had to leave. But, by that time they knew because they had been getting just the equalization case. There were threats and jobs lost and the rest. So, but that's a really important piece of the story. But Waring is the person who pushes it that next step to that moment, and the people were ready. And so the Briggs case went forward, and of course it was heard before 3 federal judge court, and 2-1 upholding segregation. But Waring writes a historic opinion that uses the language that will be folded ultimately into the Brown versus Board decision in 1954.
All right, so I'm going to just kind of help our listeners put all this in perspective, if I can. So ultimately, Waring writes the dissenting opinion in the 2-1 case. And as she just said, Vincent, it makes its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I believe rules unanimously against segregation. And they use, as Pat just said, part of Waring's dissent in their order. And that was the case that ultimately overturned, was it Plessy?
Yeah, yes. I mean, it was Brown versus Board. What we know as Brown versus Board of Education, which was a combination of these cases that were brought here and
but
around.
It overturns Plessy versus Ferguson.
It does, and the separate but equal decisions that had occurred many years before. And it's important to remember, Joel, that this wasn't easy on the federal level as well. There were new appointees to the Supreme Court. And Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice at the time and a fairly new one, assembled this unanimous coalition, which has had implications, positive implications, and certainly fundamental change for the country for a long time now.
It's really amazing, Pat, when you think about the series of events that had to come together. And I give Richard a lot of credit. I asked Richard, what got you so interested in this? And he said, I was doing research on Waring because Richard's in that courthouse now. And I noticed, how Waring, took a very active role in some cases that weren't very popular for Southern judges to become active in. And I wanted to know why. And he started doing research and he stumbled across this Isaac Woodard case. And, so just to bring it to today, in Batesburg, South Carolina, there is now a monument recognizing Sergeant Woodard. I guess he ended up passing away, maybe about 20 years ago, Pat? Is that right? Sergeant Woodard? Sergeant Woodard passed away about 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think it was, no, it's a little more than that, 1992, so 30.
Yeah, and do we know kind of what happened to him? Did he ever fully appreciate, do you think, the significant impact that he had on changing the course of public policy in our country? Maybe
to a certain extent, but not fully. I mean, he didn't realize the impact of this case on President Truman. For a short time, he was at the center of attention. He toured. He was a way to bring this situation to a large public and raise lots of money for the NASB and for himself. I mean, they raised money for Isaac Woodard to sort of, get by living up in New York. But again, and he managed to had rental housing and the rest, but he moved back into obscurity and died in 1992, not fully knowing. And really, most people until Richard's book have not really appreciated the pivotal significance of this case and how it played out in the way that it did.
All right, Pat, it's a fascinating case. I would encourage all of our listeners to go Google Isaac Woodard or get Richard's book, Unexampled Courage. I read it. I couldn't put it down. I bought copies, literally the Barnes & Noble near where our office is. They have no more copies. It's a fabulous book. But speaking of books, in a few minutes before we close up, tell our audience about the work you've done on Bobby Kennedy, because you were nice enough to send me a copy of the book, and I started getting through it during the Labor Day weekend, and really just I've become such a, most recently, student of history, student of what's happening during the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. As you know, my father was one of John Kennedy's campaign co-managers in South Carolina, which, by the way, Vincent, South Carolina's voted for a Democrat twice. John Kennedy.
Since John Kennedy.
No, once since John Kennedy.
Jimmy Carter.
Kennedy in 60 and Carter in, I guess, 76. Tell us about your book, Justice Rising, and a little bit about what our audience, what our listeners could expect to find.
My book focuses on Robert Kennedy in relationship to the civil rights developments of the 1960s. And in many ways, it sort of echoes Richard's book. When you, as a historian, when you start to dig around, you see how the struggle for civil rights and how it's playing out, and certain moments in our history which open it up for, like the sit-ins in 1960, really put civil rights again on the national agenda post-Brown. And someone like Robert Kennedy, responded. I mean, not just to the demand, as well as his brother, not just to the demand of the civil rights movement, but to the opportunity it created to move the country further forward. I mean, beyond the place where we saw in the 1940s, but it's very connected to the post-World War II period. The 60s built on that. And so I have a very different, I guess Robert Kennedy was my way in to this decade and to really the complex sets of events and people who successfully, the final push against Jim Crow that Brown initiated with the overturning of Plessy, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and pressuring the federal government and creating the opportunity for the federal government to act. And in the case of the Kennedys, it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that finally fulfills what Brown started and ends legally mandated segregation in the South. But the other thing about the Robert Kennedy book, just quickly, it's in a national context, and it reminds readers that racial discrimination was national and really deeply embedded in cities across the country in response to the great migration of African Americans moving north. And so the latter part of the 1960s, with the urban uprisings and all of that, sort of raised issues that our country is still struggling with today.
Which is sad but coincidental that this was 60 years ago, and in many ways we are struggling with those same issues today, as you just noted. Hey, I want to ask you a quick question because we got to wrap up. But you get into this early in the book. Two takeaways I have. Number one, Robert Kennedy was not afraid to stir things up. He was not afraid to speak truth to power, and he wasn't afraid to call it like he saw it. But I felt it was also kind of interesting about the relationship he and President Johnson had, because they weren't exactly besties, were they?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing that I discovered in writing my book. I mean, everybody who pays any attention to political history knows that they didn't like each other. But the point I found is that they really differed on their response to the racial crisis in the country, not just the South, in the country. I mean, Robert Kennedy read James Baldwin in 1962 and 63. He understood this is not a Southern problem. This is a national problem. And I think President Johnson's response to the uprisings and riots of the later 60s was very different from Robert Kennedy's, who really tried to compel our country to face the problems of entrenched poverty, the problems which we read about in Richard's book of police brutality. Again, issues that we struggle with. So they didn't like each other, but also they had a very different approach to what, how the country needed to face and respond to the deeper problems beyond taking down Jim Crow signs, the deeper problems of racial injustice.
Well, our listeners can find your book. They can order it online. They can find it in most bookstores. I'm just getting into it, Vincent. I'm sure you will too. Patricia Sullivan, a professor of history in the College of Arts and Sciences, who is joining us from a work day in Martha's Vineyard. We can't thank you enough for joining our podcast. I look forward to sharing a cup of coffee with you sooner than later.
I'll be back on Saturday, so give me a shout.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you both. Thanks.
Okay, Vincent, before we wrap up, let's take a quick moment and hear from our sponsor. Hey, Vincent, guess what?
What?
We have a new sponsor for the podcast.
All right. Welcome aboard.
AARP, which has over 600,000 members in South Carolina, is our new sponsor. And Vincent, I can remember, and I'm sure you do as well, our days in the State House when it came to issues that affected, our retirees, people as they're getting older. Nobody had a stronger and more influential voice on these issues than the AARP.
Joel, I remember they help lower rates for power customers, utility customers. They help veterans. They've worked to lower health disparities in minority communities. They helped pass the cigarette tax for Medicaid programs. They've done a lot, and we welcome AARP to Bourbon in the Back Room.
600,000 members. They do things like helping prepare taxes for older people. They have a fraud watch network. They just do a lot of good things. So I join you that. Cheers to our new sponsor, AARP. Vincent, Pat Sullivan, what an interesting lady, and what a remarkable story that she told.
You know, it reminded me, Joel, I teach, as you know, a class at USC at the Honors College, and we talk about the history of South Carolina as a part of that class, and we specifically talk about the Civil Rights Movement. And today, we were talking about the Orangeburg Massacre that occurred in 1968, where our friend Bakari Sellers' father was there and imprisoned afterwards, shot. We talk about the lunch counter sit-ins in Rock Hill that occurred in 1961. I think it was 1961, and here in Columbia in 1960 and 1961, and the march that Jim Clyburn was in on the State House grounds when he was a student and arrested. And my student said to me, why don't we ever learn this in class? We learn about the civil rights in other parts of the civil rights movement in other parts of the country, the March on Washington, the lunch counter sit-ins in North Carolina. And it struck me that this Isaac Woodard story is the same, Joel. A story about a South Carolinian, what happened to him in South Carolina. It changed the world. For some reason, this state and nation just forgets about it.
Again, I think most people never knew the name Isaac Woodard until Richard started doing this research. Now, if you lived during that time, of course, you would have known. But it's a remarkable story. And I think what's remarkable about it is the way that Isaac Woodard, you know, an African-American soldier coming home from serving our country, blinded by the police chief, Linwood Shull in Batesburg, weights wearing. I mean, just think any other federal judge sits on that case, might not have been as moved by Judge Waring. It gets the attention of Harry Truman, and the rest is history.
It is, and it is amazing to think about the fact that circumstances plus character, people, is what creates change. I tell you what I'm most impressed by, Joel, though, as I read this and learn more about it is not only was Isaac Woodard at the center of the storm and in a way helped to change the world, but on a personal level, here's a man who was literally blinded unjustly. Here was a man who was literally blinded when he was attacked and treated like an animal, and he held himself with dignity and respect and continued on with his life, helped to further the cause while he could. That's an amazing, just personal story of courage and strength that I don't know a lot of people could live up to.
There's no question about that. I mean, literally, he lost his wife. Yeah. You know, he came back, he had to move in. And the book takes you in great detail with his struggles about how the doctor in Batesburg says, I think he's blind. You need to send him to the VA in Columbia. You know, then they have some relatives in New York that they come get him and he lives with them. And ultimately, you know, he lives a very, very humble lifestyle, but what an American hero. Yeah. Right. What an American. Vincent, before we wrap up, you know, we continue to get great comments.
And we love your comments. Email us at bourboninthebackroom@gmail.com or BITBR podcast at Facebook or Twitter.
All right. Good morning. As a social studies teacher at a South Carolina high school, I greatly appreciate your podcast for all the insights it sheds on politics in our state. And this again is from Patrick Kelly. But I am reaching out as Director of Government Affairs for Palmetto State Teachers Association. As you both know, the situation in our state school is getting dire, with thousands of students getting ill or being quarantined and increasing numbers of teachers leaving the profession as they break under the stress they are being placed under. For that reason, I hope your podcast can focus on the impact of the pandemic and anti-public health policies on our system of public education. Two things. First of all, Vincent, Patrick, I want to thank you for your service. I think I've had the opportunity to communicate with you when I was in the Senate. And secondly, because you're on the front lines and you've expressed what we've been trying to talk about on our podcast the last couple of weeks, which is these policies that the legislature passed, that the governor supports, and yet y'all are on the front lines trying to teach students in the wake of this pandemic. And in my opinion, and that of probably a majority of South Carolinians, all the legislature has done is made it harder for you. So thank you for your comments. And more importantly, thank you for your service. Vince, you got another one?
I do. And just remembering and thinking about that comment, the fact that South Carolina government and politics affects the citizens of this state way more than anything the federal government ever does. And it's all the more reason that this podcast and more attention needs to be paid to state government. We've got a great comment from Evan. Hi, my name is Evan, and I graduated with a BA in political science from the University of South Carolina, Aiken. Great degree. It's what I had, Evan. Then you have to figure out what you're going to do after that, right? Oh, well, here it is. I'm currently getting my master's in public administration through Clemson University. Go Tigers. And I just wanted to reach out and say the podcast is awesome. As a moderate, I really respect both sides and love that y'all treat both sides fairly and equally and have the tough discussions within our state, because it affects us more than national politics. Man, Evan and I think alike, don't we? But Evan, thank you. You know, we need more moderates in the world who want to make things better. And it's great to hear from somebody like you to talk about what matters to you. Keep listening to the podcast and share it with friends and family of yours.
You know, Vincent, before we close, I just want to catch up with you a little bit because he mentioned the word moderate. And I remember years ago, I saw a poll, I think it was on NBC News, about, you know, maybe a third of the people or 25% of people are considered to be hardcore Republicans, 25% of people are hardcore Democrats, and the other half the country are just in the middle. They,
Right.
You know, they want government to work. They want their schools they want their school children to succeed. They want their taxes spent wisely. And what concerns me about the political system today is it's so negative and polarizing that I think it pushes people further to the right or the left.
Yeah.
And where are the centrists?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, maybe it's just my character, but ideologues get on my nerves bad. I mean, I can't stand to be in the room.
On both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
On
Oh,
both
my
sides.
gosh. Sometimes my Democratic friends who are ideologues get on my nerves worse than our Republican friends who are ideologues. But,
I've been there to hear you complain about
but,
it.
but, you know, in real life, I like to say, in real life, I just want to know how to make it work. And I think most of the people in this state, in this country, just want to know how to make it work. But I will say, I agree with you that that great group in the middle, it seems to be shrinking. And even in non-public figures, you feel that radicalization on both the left and the right, even with people who you wouldn't think would be that way. There's a reaction going on in the country right now. And truthfully, this has happened across the world. I'm not sure what's driving it, but you can look at other countries and see the same phenomenon where people are moving in their own corners and unwilling to talk.
Well, they call it tribalism.
Yeah.
And if you think about it now, you know, you find yourself, you know, hanging out with people who think the same way you do. And I don't want to be that person.
Yeah,
You know
I
what I'm
agree
saying?
with
I
you.
mean, now I've learned not to discuss certain issues around certain friends. But, you know, hopefully this podcast provides people some additional insight into how sort of government works, the sausage making process.
Yeah.
And I think we've tried to give people a middle of the road political perspective on these issues.
Well, Joel, and that's why we have Republicans and Democrats and people on the right and people on the left. But by now, listeners, you will have noticed that most of our guests are right there in the middle, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. We get a little taste from the ideological extremes, but most of the folks you listen to on the show are going to be people that just want to get it done.
You're not including Curtis Loftus in that
Oh,
statement.
Curtis.
Okay. All right. The 26th episode of Bourbon in the Back Room will be back soon. Thank you for joining us. Bourbon in the Back Room is produced by Campbell Douglas and Austin Shaheen. Research by Jolie Patterson. Marketing by Megan Carlton and Holly Van Horn.